Chapter 13. I preached as never sure to preach again, and as a dying man to dying men. Richard Baxter. There was a stranger in the pulpit the next Sunday morning, one whose countenance, though youthful, by its intellectuality, its earnest thoughtfulness, and a nameless something that told of communion with God, and a strong sense of the solemn responsibility of thus standing as an ambassador for Christ, to expound his word and will to sinful dying men, gave promise of a discourse that should send empty away no attentive hearer, hungering and thirsting for the bread and the water of life. Nor was the promise unfulfilled. Taking as his text the Master's own words, "They hated me without a cause," he dwelt first upon the utter helplessness, hopelessness, and wretchedness of that estate of sin and misery into which all mankind were plunged by Adam's fall, then upon God's offered mercy through a Redeemer, even his only begotten and well-beloved Son, upon the wondrous love of Christ in offering himself a sacrifice to satisfy divine justice and reconcile us to God, as shown first in what he resigned, the joy and bliss of heaven, the glory which he had with the Father before the world was; secondly, in his birth and life on earth, of which he gave a rapid but vivid sketch from the manger to the cross, showing the meekness, patience, gentleness, benevolence, self-denial, humility, and resignation of Jesus, how true, guileless, innocent, loving, and compassionate he was, describing the miracles he wrought, every one an act of kindness to some poor sufferer from bereavement, accident, disease, or Satan's power; then the closing scenes of that wondrous life, the agony in the garden, the cruel mockery of a trial, the scourging, the crucifixion, the expiring agonies upon the cross. He paused, the audience almost held their breath for the next words, the silent tears were stealing down many a cheek. Leaning over the pulpit with outstretched hand, with features working with emotion, "I have set before you," he said, in tones thrilling with pathos, "this Jesus in his life and in his death. He lived not for himself, but for you. He died not for his own sins, but for yours and mine. He offers you this salvation as a free gift purchased with his own blood. Yea, risen again, and ever at the right hand of God, he maketh intercession for you. If you hate him, is it not without a cause?" The preacher had wholly forgotten himself and his subject, nor did self intrude into the prayer that followed the sermon. Truly he seemed to stand in the immediate presence of him who died on Calvary and rose again, as he poured out his confessions of sins, his gratitude for redeeming love, his earnest petitions for perishing souls, blindly, wickedly hating without a cause this matchless, this loving, compassionate Saviour, and for Christ's own people, that their faith might be strengthened, their love increased, that they might be very zealous for the Master, abounding in gifts and prayers and labours for the upbuilding of his cause and kingdom. "The very man we should have here, if he can be induced to come," Mr. Dinsmore said in a quiet aside to his daughter as the congregation began to disperse, going out silently, or conversing in subdued tones, for the earnest, solemn discourse had made a deep impression. "Yes, papa. Oh, I should rejoice to hear such preaching every Sabbath," was Elsie's answer. "And I," Mr. Embury said, overhearing her remark. "But Mr. Keith gave us expressly to understand that he did not come as a candidate. He is here for his health or recreation, being worn out with study and pastoral work, as I understand." "Keith!" exclaimed Mr. Dinsmore. "I thought there was something familiar in his face, Elsie. I think he must belong to our Keiths." "We must find out, papa," she said. "Oh, I shall be glad if he does." "Shall I bring him up and introduce him?" Mr. Embury asked. "Ah, here he is," as, turning about, he perceived the young minister close at hand. "Dinsmore! Travilla!" "Those are family names with us," the latter said, with an earnest, interested look from one to the other as the introductions were made. "As Keith is with us," Mr. Dinsmore answered, grasping his hand. "I opine that I am speaking to a grandson of my cousin Marcia Keith and her husband Stuart Keith, of Pleasant Plains, Indiana?" "Yes, sir, I am the son of Cyril, their second son, and bear the same name. And you, sir, are the cousin Horace of whom I have so often heard my grandmother and Aunt Mildred speak?" "The same." "And Mrs. Travilla is cousin Elsie?" turning to her with a look of great interest and pleasure, mingled with admiration, but which quickly changed to one of intense, sorrowful sympathy as he noticed her widow's weeds. He had often heard of the strong attachment between herself and husband, and this was the first intimation he had had of her bereavement. She read his look and gave him her hand silently, her heart too full for speech. "You will go home with us, of course," said Mr. Dinsmore, after introducing his wife and the other ladies of the family. "And stay as long as you possibly can," added Elsie, finding her voice. "Papa and I shall have a great many questions to ask about our cousins." "I shall be most happy to accept your kind invitation, if Mr. Embury will excuse me from a prior engagement to dine and lodge with him," replied Mr. Keith, turning with a smile to the proprietor of Magnolia Hall, who was still standing near in a waiting attitude. "I am loath to do so," he said pleasantly, "but relatives have the first claim. I will waive mine for the present in your favor, Mrs. Travilla, if you will indemnify me by permission to call frequently at Viamede while Mr. Keith stays, and afterward, if you don't find me a bore. I might as well make large demands while I am about it." "Being in a gracious mood, I grant them, large as they are," she responded in the same playful tone that he had used. "Come whenever it suits your convenience and pleasure, Mr. Embury." "Viamede," said Mr. Keith, meditatively, as they drove homeward. "I remember hearing Aunt Mildred talk of a visit she paid there many years ago, when she was quite a young girl, and you, Cousin Elsie, were a mere baby." "Yes," said old Mr. Dinsmore. "It was I who brought her. Horace was away in Europe at the time, and the death of Cameron, Elsie's guardian, made it necessary for me to come on and attend to matters. Mildred was visiting us at Roselands that winter, and I was very glad to secure her as a traveling companion. Do you remember anything about it, Elsie?" "Not very much, grandpa," she said. "A little of Cousin Mildred's kindness and affection, something of the pain of parting from my dear home and the old servants. But I have a very vivid recollection of a visit made to Pleasant Plains with papa," and she turned to him with a deeply affectionate look, "shortly before his marriage. I then saw Aunt Marcia, as both she and papa bade me call her, and Cousin Mildred and all the others, not forgetting Uncle Stewart. We had a delightful visit, had we not, papa?" "Yes, I remember we enjoyed it greatly." "I was just then very happy in the prospect of a new mamma," Elsie went on, with a smiling glance at her loved stepmother, "and papa was so very good as to allow me to tell of my happiness to the cousins. Your father was quite a tall lad at that time, Cousin Cyril, and very kind to his little cousin, who considered him a very fine young gentleman." "He is an elderly man now," remarked his son. "You have seen Aunt Mildred and some of the others of the family since then?" "Yes, several times. She and a good many of the others were with us at different times during the centennial. But why did you not let us know of your coming, Cousin Cyril? Why not come directly to us?" "It was a sudden move on my part," he said, "and indeed I was not aware that I was coming into the neighborhood of Viamede, or that you were there. But I am delighted that it is so, that I have the opportunity to become acquainted with you, and to see the place which Aunt Mildred described as a paradise upon earth." "We think it almost that, but you shall judge for yourself," she said with a pleased smile. "Beautiful! Enchanting! The half had not been told me," he exclaimed in delight, as a few moments later he stood upon the veranda gazing out over the emerald velvet of the lawn, spangled with its many hued and lovely flowers, and dotted here and there with giant oaks, graceful magnolias, and clusters of orange trees laden with their delicate, sweet-scented blossoms and golden fruit, to the lakelet whose waters glittered in the sunlight, and the fields, the groves, and hills beyond. "Ah, if earthly scenes are so lovely, what must heaven be?" he added, turning to Elsie, a face full of joyful anticipation. "Yes," she responded in low, moved tones. "How great is their blessedness who walk the streets of the celestial city! How their eyes must feast upon its beauties! And yet, methinks it must be very long ere they can see them, for gazing upon the lovely face of him whose blood has purchased the right to enter there." "Even so," he said. "Oh, for one glimpse of his face! Dear cousin," and he took her hand in his, "let the thought of the exceeding and eternal weight of glory your loved one is now enjoying, and which you will one day share with him, comfort you in your loneliness and sorrow." "It does," she said tremulously. "That and the sweet sense of his abiding love and presence who could never die and never change. I am far from unhappy, Cousin Cyril. I have found truth in those beautiful words, 'Then sorrow touched by thee grows bright with more than rapture's ray, as darkness shows us worlds of light we never saw by day.'" They had been comparatively alone for the moment, no one near enough to overhear the low-toned talk between them. The young minister was greatly pleased with Viamede, the more so the more he saw of it, and with his new-found relatives the more and better he became acquainted with them, while they found him all his earnest scriptural preaching had led them to expect. His religion was not a mask, or a garment to be worn only in the pulpit or on the Sabbath, but permeated his whole life and conversation, as was the case with most if not all of those with whom he now sojourned, and like them he was a happy Christian, content with the allotments of God's providence, walking joyously in the light of his countenance, making it the one purpose and effort of his life to live to God's glory, and bring others to share in the blessed service. He was strongly urged to spend the winter at Viamede as his cousin's guest and preacher to the two churches. He took a day or two to consider the matter, then, to the great satisfaction of all concerned, consented to remain, thanking his cousins warmly for their kindness in giving him so sweet a home, for they made him feel that he was entirely one of themselves, always welcome in their midst, yet at perfect liberty to withdraw into the seclusion of his own apartments whenever duty or inclination called him to do so. The well-stocked library supplied him with all needed books. There were servants to wait upon him, horses at his disposal, in short, nothing wanting for purposes of work or recreation. Again and again he said to himself, or in his letters to those in the home he had left, that the lines had fallen to him in pleasant places. In the meantime Elsie found the truth, as expounded by him from Sabbath to Sabbath, and in the week-day evening service and the family worship, most comforting and sustaining, while his intelligent, agreeable conversation and cheerful companionship were most enjoyable at other times. Cousin Cyril soon became a great favorite with those who claimed the right to call him so, and very much liked and looked up to by Isadore, Molly, and the rest, to whom he was simply Mr. Keith. In common with all others who knew them, he admired his young cousins Elsie and Violet extremely, and found their society delightful. Molly's sad affliction called forth from the first his deepest commiseration, her brave endurance of it, her uniform cheerfulness under it, his strong admiration and respect. Yet he presently discovered that Isadore Coadley had stronger attractions for him than any other woman he had ever met. It was not her beauty alone, her refinement, her many accomplishments, but principally her noble qualities of mind and heart, gradually opening themselves to his view, as day after day they met in the unrestrained familiar intercourse of the home circle, or walked and rode out together, sometimes in the company of others, sometimes alone. Mr. Embury made good use of the permission Mrs. Travilla had granted him, and occasionally forestalling Cyril's attentions, led the latter to look upon him as a rival. Molly watched it all, and though now one and now the other devoted an hour to her, sitting by her side in the house, doing his best to entertain her with conversation, or pushing her wheeled chair about the walks in the beautiful grounds, or taking her out for a drive, thought both were in pursuit of Isa. It was their pleasure to wait upon Isa, Elsie, and Vi, while pity and benevolence alone led them to bestow some time and effort upon herself, a poor cripple whom no one could really enjoy taking about. She had but a modest opinion of her own attractions, and would have been surprised to learn how greatly she was really admired by both gentlemen, for her good sense, her talent, energy, and perseverance in her chosen line of work, and her constant cheerfulness. How brilliant and entertaining they often found her talk, pronouncing it bright, sparkling, witty. How attractive her intellectual countenance and her bright, dark, expressive eyes. End of chapter 13.